This is Brad Carmack, author of Homosexuality, a Straight BYU Student's Perspective. I'll be going over some more studies that bear on the question of what causes homosexuality in this clip. Last time we talked about the 2 to 4 digit ratio of the hand and how those are different between men and women, and then different between the homosexually oriented compared to the heterosexually oriented subpopulation of each gender. We also discussed twin studies, and we talked a little bit about sex determination. So we're going to kind of go from there. We're going to cover a number of studies which bear on this question. The next one is childhood gender nonconformity. So across cultures, girls and boys behave in ways that are measurable and significantly different. For instance, how often a child will look at his or her mother's face, how often they'll play with the opposite gender, take turns, take risks if they prefer rough and tumble play compared to kind of playing with dolls, or if they like dressing up and clothing, those types of things. So we're aware of what the stereotypes are and what the norms are for girls and boys. So the kind of theory that people are molested into homosexual orientation, or they choose it, or they're infected by it, would predict that if you know a particular individual's childhood behavior on whether they're gender conformist or gender nonconformist, it probably on average isn't going to tell you very much, if anything, on whether the person will report being homosexually oriented as an adult, because most of those factors, such as choice and being molested and being infected, will usually exert most of their influence after early childhood, so later childhood, adolescence, or afterwards. The theory that homosexual orientation is caused mostly by genes and prenatal hormones, on the other hand, would predict that there would be gender nonconformity, meaning that those who are homosexually oriented, for instance men, would act a little bit more like the stereotypical girl behaviors as children, and less like the stereotypical boy when that boy is young. There's been over 40 studies that confirm a high correlation between childhood nonconformity and adult homosexual orientation. Okay, so that's a little bit about childhood gender nonconformity. And again, as we go through some of these studies, if you want to kind of keep a tally, you can kind of make a judgment call for yourself on which theory you think holds the most water. And of course, you're welcome to look at all the references that support what we're talking about here in my book at bradcarmack.blogspot.com. You can go and download the whole thing. There's over 600 endnotes. It's pretty well supported, and you can check them out for yourself. Okay, so the next effect or factor will be known, or is known in the literature as the older brother effect. It's the idea that if an individual has more or less older brothers, that can have a predictive effect on whether or not that individual will report being homosexually oriented as an adult. Again, the idea that people are molested, choose, or are infected by homosexual orientation, you wouldn't really expect that having an older brother would have much of an effect, unless somehow older brothers are contributing to causing homosexual orientation, which it could possibly be shown. There could be a test device to address that. However, it does seem that there is a hypothesis that a mother's immune system, when she has a XY chromosome creature inside of her, and she's XX, again this is the sex chromosome genotype of the individual or the fetus, that there's a moderate defense during the course of pregnancy against the Y chromosome antigens. Kind of is like the womb says, hey, this is a foreign creature, this is XY, not XX, and it kind of mounts a little bit of an immune response, or sort of endocrine action response. And so in subsequent pregnancies, this response may be exacerbated, and the more that the fetus is feminized, the less it's in danger from the sort of defense that's put on by the mother. Anyway, it's unknown. I don't think there's a lot of research that strongly evidences that whether or not that hypothesis is correct. But what the studies do show is that compared to having no older brother, each older brother increases the likelihood of an individual being homosexually oriented by 33%. Okay, so individuals as adults reporting homosexual orientation are much more likely to have an older brother than those who don't. Now, of course, it doesn't apply to everyone that's homosexually oriented. It just means that there's a statistically significant increase. Again, that's about 33% per older brother. So we've talked about childhood gender nonconformity. We've talked about the older brother effect. Let's talk about handedness. The theory that homosexual orientation is chosen, or you're molested into it, or you are recruited or infected by homosexual orientation from another homosexual individual would predict that handedness probably wouldn't have much of an effect. Why would somebody be more prone to be molested if they're left versus right-handed? Why would they be more likely to choose homosexual orientation? Why would they be more or less likely to be infected? The biological theory would probably predict that there might be a correlation if in fact there's some sort of connection between the sex determination, causation chain, and handedness. It turns out that gay men are on average less shifted in their handedness, so they're more often left-handed compared with straight men, and lesbians are very shifted towards non-right-handedness compared to heterosexual women. So there are significant differences between the homosexually oriented compared to the heterosexually oriented subgroups of those genders. Let's talk about combining those last two. We talked about the older brother effect and handedness. Now let's talk about putting those together. Again, the theory that homosexual orientation is chosen, or you're molested into it, or you are recruited into it. It wouldn't predict any correlation between the number of older brothers and handedness, or in concert. However, there is a correlation such that the older brother effect, meaning that you're more likely to be homosexual oriented if you have older brothers by 33% per older brother, only applies to right-handed and not left-handed men. Now remember that gay men are more often left-handed. They're less shifted in their handedness compared to their heterosexual peers. I know we're going kind of fast here. If you're taking notes, our next sort of area that we're going to look at here, and in my book I call these parking lots. The idea is, let's say you're having a dispute with your friend, you're in Disneyland, and one of you says that you went and parked out in the Pumbaa lot, and the other one says that you were in the Mufasa lot. Well, the way that you find out who is right is you go out to both lots and see if the car is in the Mufasa or the Pumbaa. And wherever you find the car, well, you know who was right. And so the idea is to make a prediction based on the theory. So either the biological theory or the theory that homosexual orientation is chosen, you're infected by it, or you're molested into it, and then see whether those predictions hold when you take a look at the observations. So the next area we're going to look at, the next parking lot, if you will, is the ratio of limb length to trunk length. Okay, so the distance between sort of the waist and the neck compared to the length of the limbs. There is a significant difference between men and women on average in these limb to trunk ratios. The theory that people are molested or choose their homosexual orientation wouldn't really predict that you would be able to tell any correlation between the orientation of a particular individual and that particular individual's limb to trunk ratio. The biological theory would predict that if there is a connection again between that sex determination and the ratio of the limb length to the trunk length, then certainly you would be able to see a correlation. What do we observe when we go out to the parking lot? Homosexual-oriented men do have a ratio that's shifted towards heterosexual women and away from heterosexual-oriented men. And also, homosexual-oriented women, or lesbians, have a ratio shifted towards that of heterosexual men and away from that of heterosexual women. So we do observe those shifts there. And of course, every time there's a prediction that's verified, it doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it does make one theory seem more likely than the other. Let's take a look at another parking lot, gait, or kind of your walking style, and voice quality. Sort of the stereotype, of course, that gay men sort of strut and walk kind of in girly ways, and that they have high, sometimes annoying voices, or at least girly voices. What do we observe when we take a look at the heterosexually oriented compared to the homosexually oriented populations in men and women? We find gender-shifted gait and voice quality. So homosexually oriented men do have a voice quality and a gait that's more like heterosexually oriented women, and lesbians have a gender shift of voice quality and gait towards that of heterosexual men and away from that of heterosexual women. The next parking lot we'll look at is cross-cultural rates of homosexual orientation. So if there are some cultures that do more molesting or some cultures where it's cooler to be, it's more hip to be homosexual oriented, or where it's more likely that homosexual oriented people will recruit or infect other straight people to become homosexual oriented, you would predict that those cultures would have a higher incidence of homosexual orientation compared to the cultures which don't do as much molesting or recruiting, or have it be as cool in that culture to be homosexual oriented. The biological one, on the other hand, would say, there might be some differences if the endocrine disruptors or the genes in certain regional populations are significantly different than other regions, but otherwise you're probably not going to see a lot of significant variability in the incidence of homosexual orientation across cultures. What do we observe? Cross-culturally, the incidence of homosexual orientation is fairly constant, meaning that the ratio of homosexual-oriented men compared to homosexual-oriented women, the gay to lesbian ratio is about the same, and the incidence in the population is about the same as well. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at another parking lot, personality and gender-associated occupational preference. So there are definitely some occupations which on average men prefer, or that we see more men in compared to ones that we see women in. And given a culture or a workplace environment where both are sort of equal opportunity, we could make some reasonable inferences about whether there are differences between the homosexual-oriented population and their occupational preference, and also in personality, things like empathy, expressiveness, and if there are any sort of stereotypical gender differences in personality, we could tease that out and say, hey, is the homosexual-oriented population different than the heterosexual-oriented population on this metric of personality, for instance. What do we observe? We do see significant gender shifts in physical aggressiveness, empathy, expressiveness, aesthetic interests, and gender-associated occupational preferences in gay men and lesbian women. And it's in the direction that we would, again, presume. The lesbian woman norm is gender shifted towards the heterosexual male norm and away from the heterosexual female norm, and for the gay men is shifted towards the heterosexual female norm and away from the average for heterosexual men. Next parking lot, let's go ahead and take a look at cognitive traits. It's known that the genders perform significantly different on average on certain cognitive tests when they perform mental functions such as rotating objects in space, targeting, navigation, verbal fluency, letter fluency, synonym fluency, judgment of orientation on lines, remembering the location of objects on a page, etc. So let's again take a look at those metrics that are different for men and women and see if there's any gender shift for the homosexual-oriented population of women compared to the heterosexual-oriented population and also of men. What do we observe when we do these tests? With the exception of lesbians who don't do any worse than women on object location, the homosexual-oriented subset of both genders do indeed perform atypically on these metrics, including letter fluency, verbal fluency, synonym fluency, judgment of line orientation, location of objects on a page, targeting, navigation, and the mental rotation of objects. Okay. Let's go ahead and take a look at another parking lot. In my book, this is parking lot 13. I'll take a look at molestation rates. So the theory that homosexual orientation is caused by being molested or being infected or choosing or some combination of the three would definitely predict. If you're molested as a child, then you're more likely to be gay or lesbian. And there are different theories whether or not if you're a man, are you more likely to be gay if you're molested by a woman or if you're molested by a man. And in any case, the theory would say that for one or both of those, whether you're molested by a man or a woman, depending on if you are female or male as a child, there's going to be a greater incidence for you and for that population of being homosexually oriented as an adult. There have been a couple studies that have borne this question, and there is that are often cited as evidence that molestation does increase homosexual orientation. And of course, we have the same problems as in other studies of being sure of our results, and that homosexual orientation is self-reported, and there are errors in self-report. However, in looking at a lot of these differences, for instance, difference in the 2 to 4 digit ratio of the hands, If there are errors, they're either false positives or false negatives, meaning that there are some homosexual-oriented people that are lying and they're actually straight, or there's some heterosexual-oriented people that are lying that are actually gay. In both situations, they tend to erode the difference between the homosexual-oriented and the heterosexual-oriented population. Because, for instance, if you've got somebody lying about being straight when actually they're gay, that's going to bring the difference, the top down, and if you're lying about being gay and you're actually straight, it's going to bring the bottom up, such that you wouldn't expect to see significant differences. The fact that we do still see differences that are statistically significant suggests that even with the false positives and the false negatives in our reporting error, we're observing significant differences, which tends to support the biological theory that would predict that there would be such differences. Anyway, back to the molestation. In a lot of the studies that are cited, over 95% of the subjects reported being aware of their homosexual orientation before the incest or sexual relationships with adults. Also, it's uncontested that a lot of straight people were molested as children, both homosexually, I guess through the same gender and also through the opposite gender, and they turn out straight. There's also a number of homosexual-oriented people that report not being molested as children. Now that could still exist. There could still be some sort of weak or partial correlation between molestation and homosexual orientation, but doesn't. In my book, I wasn't quite sure how to score this lot. It's kind of dicey, but it doesn't seem that there's strong evidence to suggest that molestation plays a significant role in accounting for the variability in sexual orientation. Okay, for the last little parking lot for this vid, before we go into part 3, we're going to take a look at boarding school. Again, those that think that molestation or infection or choice are responsible for homosexual orientation, they would predict that children that go to a same-sex boarding school where there's more sexual experimentation and molestation would be more homosexual oriented than their counterparts as adults. In Britain, there's a lot of individuals, children, adolescents, that go to same-sex boarding schools, and as adults, they don't engage in homosexual behavior any more than those who didn't go to boarding schools. It doesn't entirely answer our question because we're looking at homosexual orientation, not homosexual behavior, but some would look to that as an indicator. Thanks.